He slid the divorce papers across the marble table like he was tipping a servant, didn't look up, didn't say her name. Just pushed the folder toward her with 2 fingers and turned back to his attorney, already laughing at something the man had said. Imani Okoye picked up the papers. Read the first line. Set them back down. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing nobody in that room would understand until much later. Her hands didn't shake at all. Kang Tae-hyun had spent 11 years building a life with this woman, and he was ending it the same way he ended everything that had outlived its usefulness, without ceremony, without apology, and without once looking her in the eye. He had made one mistake, one catastrophic, irreversible mistake. He had never once asked who she was before she married him. If you've ever been in a room where someone you loved looked straight through you like you were furniture, hit the like button right now. Because what happens next in this story is for every person who was ever underestimated by someone who should have known better. Subscribe to this channel and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. You won't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. The Seoul Central Family Court was not a dramatic place by design. It was bureaucratic, fluorescent, and faintly smelled of recycled air and old paper. The kind of building where lives got redistributed and nobody raised their voice above a professional murmur. Security guards stood near the door with the bored posture of men who had seen too many endings to be moved by any of them. Kang Tae-hyun arrived 18 minutes late. He did it on purpose. His attorney, a barrel-chested man named Cho Dae-won, who had spent 20 years keeping dangerous men out of prison, had advised against it. Punctuality signals respect for the process, Dae-won had said. Tae-hyun had smiled at him the way he smiled at everyone who gave him advice he didn't plan to take. He walked in wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Beside him, Yoon Ha-rin moved in a cloud of expensive perfume, her heels clicking against the tile with a rhythm that seemed designed to announce her arrival. She was beautiful in the specific way that money amplifies. Not naturally stunning, but carefully constructed, every detail managed and maintained. She touched Tae-hyun's arm as they entered, and he let her, though he didn't look at her either. He was scanning the room. Imani sat at the table on the opposite side. She was already there, which meant she had arrived on time, maybe early, which told him everything he believed he needed to know about the current state of her desperation. She wore a gray cardigan that had been washed too many times, the kind of fabric that loses its shape after years of use. Her shoes were flat, dark, unremarkable. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her nose, and she was looking at a document her attorney had placed in front of her. The attorney was an old man. Tae-hyun clocked him immediately. Elderly, slight, wearing a suit that was clean but dated, sitting with the careful stillness of someone who conserved his energy. Attorney Baek Sung-jin. Tae-hyun's team had researched him, semi-retired, modest case history, no high-profile wins in the last decade, no serious litigation muscle. Tae-hyun almost felt sorry for her. Almost. He sat down without greeting anyone, opened the folder Dae-won slid in front of him, and spent 3 minutes reviewing documents he had already reviewed 6 times. It was theater. Everything today was theater, and he was the only one who knew it. The judge entered. Formalities were exchanged. The room arranged itself around procedure. And then Attorney Dae-won spoke. He outlined the terms of the proposed settlement with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to winning. The offer was specific: a lump sum payment of 200 million Korean won, a modest apartment in a middle-tier district of Seoul, and a monthly stipend for 3 years. Generous, by the calculation of a man who believed his wife had nothing and no options. Tae-hyun watched the judge's face as Dae-won spoke. He watched Baek Sung-jin's face. He watched Imani's face. She was still reading the document in front of her, not the settlement offer, her own document. That was the first thing that snagged at him, faintly, the way a loose thread catches without tearing. Attorney Baek did not respond to the settlement terms immediately. He set down his pen, folded his hands on the table, and looked at the judge with an expression of profound and patient courtesy. "Your Honor," he said, "before we address terms, the respondent wishes to enter several items of financial documentation into the record." Dae-won straightened almost imperceptibly. "The petitioner objects to any procedural—" "The documentation is directly germane to the marital estate," Baek said, without raising his voice, without rushing the words. The petitioner cannot object to relevance before the documents have been identified. The judge nodded once. Proceed. What followed was not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes are dramatic in films. There was no shouting. There was no single moment of revelation. It came in layers, each document handed to the clerk with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been building this case for a very long time. The first document was a statement from a financial institution in Singapore. It identified 3 accounts held under a corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The corporate entity was listed as a holding company for a Seoul-based conglomerate. The conglomerate was, according to the subsequent document, majority owned by Kang Tae-hyun through a series of layered subsidiaries. The accounts held, collectively, the equivalent of $68 million. These accounts had not been disclosed in the petitioner's financial declaration. Tae-hyun felt the room change before he fully processed the information. It was a physical thing, the shift in atmosphere, the way a temperature drop announces weather before the storm is visible. He looked at Daewon. Daewon was already leaning forward, already calculating. The second document was a Hong Kong business registry. 3 shell companies, incorporated over 5 years, all tracing back to a single nominee director whose testimony, attached as an affidavit, confirmed the beneficial owner was the petitioner. The third document was a property record. It was the penthouse. Tae-hyun kept his face very still. It took everything he had. The penthouse in Gangnam, purchased 18 months ago, registered under the name of a corporate trust, furnished at extraordinary cost, currently occupied by a person whose name appeared in the attached lease addendum. Harin's name. Not her legal name, her name as she was known, which was enough. Harin, beside him, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. He did not look at her. The judge was reading, the clerk was stamping, the room was breathing differently. Tae-hyun uncapped his pen and wrote a single word on the notepad in front of him for Daewon to read. How? Daewon didn't look at the notepad. I was watching Baek Sungjin, and the expression on Daewon's face was one that Tae-hyun had never seen there before. It took a moment to identify. It was the expression of a man who has realized he underestimated the opponent. Tae-hyun breathed. He reassembled himself. He had survived worse than a bad document drop in a courtroom. He had survived things that would break ordinary men into pieces. A financial ambush from a quiet woman in a faded cardigan was a setback, not a defeat. He knew how to turn setbacks. The recess came after 40 minutes of procedural sparring, with Daewon filing objections to the authentication of 3 of the documents and the judge reserving ruling on 2 of them. It was ground lost, but not catastrophic ground. There were still moves available. Tae-hyun moved into the hallway. Imani was already there, standing near a window at the far end, looking out at the gray city below. She had a paper cup of coffee that she was holding in both hands, not drinking, just holding. Her attorney was somewhere behind him. Tae-hyun could hear the old man talking quietly to a court clerk. He walked toward her without looking like he was walking toward her. He stopped at the window and looked out at the same gray skyline. "You should take the offer," he said. His voice was low, conversational, the voice he used for business. "The additional documentation, that's a problem for the court to sort out. It doesn't change what I'm offering you." Imani looked out the window. She took a slow breath through her nose. "You always believed that money was the solution to everything. It usually is. You're going to offer me more." It wasn't a question. "I might." He turned to look at her profile. The glasses, the cardigan, the cheap shoes. He had never understood her. In 11 years, he had never been able to read her the way he could read everyone else. It used to interest him. Later, it irritated him. Eventually, he had stopped trying. "You know what this becomes if it goes further? It gets ugly. It gets public. You don't want that." She turned to look at him then. Her eyes behind the glasses were steady and dark and entirely unbothered. Tae-hyun. She said his name the way she had always said it, without the honorific, without softening it, with a directness that he had once found unusually compelling in a woman who appeared so soft in every other way. "Tell the court the truth about the accounts, all of them. End this honestly." He stared at her. "You're negotiating with me. I'm giving you an opportunity." Something moved through him. Not fear. He didn't call it fear. Something with sharper edges than irritation. An opportunity. He repeated the words back to her with the specific inflection he used to reduce people. "You came into this marriage with nothing. I let you carry my name for 11 years. You lived in my house, used my money, attended my events, and you think you have something to offer me." He let that land. Then, lower. "Take this moment, Imani, because if you push this, I will make sure you leave this courthouse with less than what you came in with, and I will enjoy it." She looked at him for a long moment. Something behind her eyes shifted. Not hurt, not anger. It was more like the expression of someone watching a thing they predicted come true and finding no satisfaction in having been right. "I gave you the same chance I would give anyone," she said. She picked up her coffee. She walked back toward the courtroom doors. He watched her go. The cheap shoes on the courthouse tile, the cardigan moving with her. She didn't look back. He told himself the cold that moved through his chest was just the building's air conditioning. Back inside, the judge reconvened. Daewon had prepared a counter-strategy. Shift the narrative to Imani's background, establish that her contributions to the marital estate were negligible, reinforce the settlement as more than fair given her circumstances. It was aggressive but legally sound. Taehyun had approved it before entering the building. Daewon stood, straightened his jacket, and began. He was 3 sentences into characterizing Imani as a woman without professional background, without financial literacy, without independent means. When Taehyun watched Attorney Beck quietly set a new folder on the table, D1 pivoted without breaking his delivery, because that was what good litigators did, and moved into the section about the petitioner's self-made status. He used words like self-sufficient and merit-based and independent achievement, words that formed a comparison without stating one. And then Daewon made his first real error. He said, and it was on the record before Taehyun could stop it. The petitioner further notes that the respondent entered this marriage as an immigrant of modest and uncertain origins, with no documented professional standing, no established family network of consequence, and no independent financial history. Imani sat perfectly still. Attorney Beck did not object. He made a small note on his notepad and set down his pen. Taehyun felt the cold again, because he had been in enough rooms with enough dangerous people to know that sometimes the most frightening response to a threat was no response at all. Daewon concluded his characterization and sat. The judge looked at Baek. "Does the respondent wish to address the petitioner's characterization?" Baek Sungjin looked up from his notepad. He was 81 years old. He had been practicing law for 56 of those years. He had the face of a man who had heard everything and been surprised by very little. He looked at the judge with the quiet authority of someone who knows exactly how much time he needs and refuses to take more than that. "Not at this time, Your Honor," he said. "The respondent will allow the record to speak when the full record is present." It was a strange answer. The judge noted it but did not press. Procedurally, it was Baek's right. Daewon glanced at Taehyun. Taehyun gave him nothing. There was a knock at the courtroom door. Not a tentative knock, a formal one. The particular percussion of official business, the sound of authority identifying itself before entering. The security officer near the door exchanged a look with the court clerk, who rose and moved to the entrance. The door opened. The first person through it wore a uniform that didn't belong to any Korean institution. Navy and gold, structured, precise. Behind him came 2 more in the same uniform, and then 3 in the diplomatic dress of a foreign mission. Dark suits with small flag pins on the lapel, carrying sealed document cases. And behind them, 2 guards in ceremonial dress, the kind worn by royal households. Every head in the courtroom turned. Taehyun's body went very still, the specific stillness of an animal that has heard something it cannot yet name and is waiting for its nervous system to catch up to the information. The lead officer, military bearing, controlled gaze, walked to the center of the courtroom, stopped, and looked directly at Imani. And then he dropped to one knee. The floor was cold and hard, and he knelt on it without hesitation, without awkwardness, the way a man does something he has done before and will do again. "Your Royal Highness," he said, we apologize for the delay." The room stopped, not metaphorically. The actual ambient sound of the courthouse, the ventilation, the shuffling papers, the faint noise of the building being a building, all of it seemed to go mute, as though the air itself had paused. Imani set down her paper coffee cup. She reached up and removed her reading glasses. She folded them and placed them carefully on the table in front of her. Then she reached up to the base of her neck, pulled loose a single pin, and let her braided hair down in one slow movement. She stood. The woman who stood was the same woman who had been sitting there for the past 2 hours. Same face, same cardigan, same shoes. Nothing physical had changed, but something in the way she occupied space changed completely, with the same sudden irreversibility as a key turning in a lock. Attorney Beck rose as well, and he handed the lead diplomat a sealed envelope. The diplomat opened it, withdrew the documents inside, and placed them before the judge with both hands, the formal gesture of official submission. The judge read. He read for a long time. When he looked up, his face had the careful blankness of a professional who has just received information that reorders his understanding of the proceeding he is conducting. The court, he said slowly, will note the submission of diplomatic documentation from the Kingdom of Kambara, identifying the respondent as... He paused. Read the line again. Princess Imani Adebayo Okoye, sole heir to the Okoye royal dynasty, and listed controlling owner of the Royal Bank of Kambara, a sovereign investment institution. Taehyun heard it. Every word of it. He heard it, and his brain did what brains do when they receive information that contradicts 11 years of constructed certainty. It tried to reject it, tried to find the error, the deception, the trick angle. There had to be a trick angle. There was always a trick angle. He looked at Imani. She was looking back at him, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time to watch someone's face in the moment of reckoning. She was looking at him the way she had always looked at him, directly, steadily, and with the particular sadness of someone who had hoped, until quite recently, that things might have gone differently. Taehyun Kong, feared head of the Black Dragon Syndicate, ruler of an underground empire that stretched from Seoul to Singapore, a man who had never once in his adult life felt the ground shift beneath him without warning, sat in a courtroom chair and understood for the first time that the woman he had called worthless had been holding the ground beneath him the whole time, and she had just let go. The judge set down the documents and his room stayed broken open in that specific way rooms do when something has happened that cannot be walked back. Taehyun was still sitting. That was the thing he would hate most about this moment. Later, in the place where he would have a great deal of time to reconstruct it, that he had stayed seated, that his body had made that choice for him, had overridden the reflex to stand, to move, to do something with his hands. He sat in his charcoal suit and he looked at the woman across from him, and for the first time in a very long time, Kang Taehyun did not know what to do next. Daewon leaned toward him. His voice was barely above a breath. "Did you know?" Taehyun said nothing. Daewon took that as an answer. He straightened, picked up his pen, and began writing on his notepad with the focused urgency of a man trying to rebuild a collapsing structure with whatever materials are still in reach. Harin had not moved. She sat one chair removed from Taehyun with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on the back of the chair in front of her. Her perfume, which had filled the room when they entered, had somehow become the most incongruous thing present, sweet and expensive and entirely wrong for the air that now occupied the space. The diplomat finished his formal submission. The royal guard stood at measured distance from Imani's table, not flanking her performatively, but present in the way that made it clear their presence was not optional. The lead officer, who had knelt, who had said those 2 words that were still reverberating in Taehyun's chest, stood at rest position near the door. He did not look at Taehyun. None of them looked at Taehyun. That was its own message. The judge spoke. The court will take a brief recess to review the submitted documentation. All parties will remain available. He rose. The room rose with him, the mechanical reflex of procedural respect. The moment the judge's chamber door closed, the room came apart. Daewon gripped Taehyun's elbow and steered him toward the far corner near the window, moving with the focused urgency of a man trying to minimize exposure. Taehyun let himself be moved. He needed the distance from the center of the room. He needed a wall behind him. "Talk to me," Daewon said. His voice was low and controlled, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the rapid calculations of a man repricing everything he thought he understood about a situation. 11 years. You never ran a background check. You never... Nothing? She was a graduate student. Taehyun's voice came out flat. I met her at a university conference. She had a student visa, a shared apartment with 3 other women. She used a second-hand laptop. A cover. Apparently. Did she ever... any indication? No. And that was the truth that was sitting in Taehyun's chest like a stone dropped in standing water, sending rings outward that would not stop. In 11 years, Imani had never once behaved like a woman with something to hide. She had been quiet and self-contained and faintly, persistently sad in the last 3 years since the distance between them had solidified into something structural. She had cooked, she had read, she had attended every event he required her to attend, and she had stood at appropriate distance and smiled at appropriate moments, and she had never, in 11 years, once slipped. Not a word, not a gesture, not a phone call he had intercepted or a document he had found. His people had done cursory checks in the early years. He was not careless, he was never careless, but she had been exactly what she appeared to be, and so eventually the checking had stopped. She was very good, he said. Daewon stared at him. She wasn't performing, Taehyun. That's the problem. If she was performing, we could find the seams. There are no seams because it wasn't a performance. Taehyun looked across the room. Imani was standing near her table, speaking quietly with attorney Baek. One of the diplomats had produced a phone, and she was looking at something on it with the focused attention of a woman reviewing a schedule, not the expression of someone who had just detonated a bomb in a courthouse. Her hair was still down. He had seen her hair down before, in the mornings, early, before she put it up, in those last few years when they still shared physical space without intention. He had never thought about it as anything except her hair. He made himself look away. Karen had finally moved. She was standing now, slightly apart from where they'd been sitting, and her arms were crossed against her chest. The posture of a woman who has realized that the territory she thought she was acquiring has just rearranged itself entirely. She caught Taehyun's eye when he turned and he watched her recalibrate, watched the fear flicker, and then get managed, and then get replaced with something that was trying to look like loyalty but was working too hard at it. He crossed the room to her in 6 steps. "Say nothing," he said, quietly. Not cruelly, just factually, the tone he used when he needed someone to understand that they were receiving an instruction, not a suggestion. "Taehyun, I didn't... The penthouse is in a trust document that is now in the court record. Your name is in a lease addendum that is now in the court record. You will say nothing to no one until I tell you otherwise. Do you understand me?" She swallowed. Her jaw tightened. For a moment he could see the thing behind her careful beauty, the ambition that had always been there, the particular hunger of someone who had constructed themselves very deliberately and did not intend to lose what they'd built. It had been one of the things that attracted him to her, that hunger. It felt familiar. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was very low. "Who is she?" "Someone I underestimated." "She's a princess." "Apparently." "She owns a bank." "Yes." Karen stared at him. Behind her eyes, something was moving very fast. "And you want to divorce her?" He looked at her. "I wanted to divorce her this morning. The situation has changed." "Changed how? Changed in what way exactly does this... Harin!" His voice dropped another register. "Stop talking." She stopped. But her eyes didn't, and he filed that away because eyes that keep moving when a mouth has gone still belong to a person who is already planning their next move, and he would need to account for that. He went back to Daewon. "Revised strategy," he said. "I'm already there," Daewon said. "The prenuptial agreement becomes critical. If the marital estate argument shifts based on her actual assets, she has a prenup." Daewon paused. She signed, "I insisted, before the wedding. My attorney at the time drafted it. Standard protections, my assets, my business interests, any holdings predating the marriage." She signed without objection. Daewon was quiet for 2 full seconds. "Who drafted it?" "Yoon Song-il. He's retired now." "Did she have independent counsel review it before signing?" Taehyun thought back. It had been 11 years ago, and he had been 34 and enormously certain of himself, which was to say, he had been exactly as certain of himself as he was right now, which was a thought he didn't complete. "She had an attorney present. I don't know who arranged it." Daewon looked at the ceiling briefly, the expression of a man doing mathematics he doesn't like the answer to. "If she had counsel and signed voluntarily, the prenup holds. The question is what it protects and in which direction." "Explain." "A prenuptial agreement protects premarital assets. If she had assets she did not disclose before the marriage, sovereign bank holdings, royal inheritance, investment portfolios, and those assets continue to generate value during the marriage. The question of whether that growth is marital property is a legal argument, not a settled fact. Daewon paused. But it also means that what you signed protected you, not just her. Anything she had before the marriage is hers. Anything you had before the marriage is yours. The marriage itself, the shared years, the shared household, that's the contested territory, and that territory is considerably less valuable than it was 40 minutes ago. Taehyun processed this. She trapped me. You trapped yourself, Daewon said, and then had the professional wisdom to immediately continue speaking so that sentence didn't sit in the air between them. You insisted on a prenup that protects separate assets. Her assets are separate. The offshore accounts, the penthouse, the shell company holdings. Those are now in question as marital estate contributions from your side. If she argues those funds came partially from entities she has a banking relationship with, she has standing to claim you used her institutional connections to build wealth you then hid from the shared estate. Taehyun felt something in his stomach that he did not name. The Royal Bank of Canberra, he said slowly. The Singapore accounts. Daewon looked at him. The primary investment partner for the Cayman Holding Company, Taehyun said. It was coming together the way things came together when you finally allowed yourself to look at the shape of something instead of its pieces. 3 years ago. Anonymous sovereign institutional investor. 12% equity stake in the holding company. I never identified the principal because he stopped. Because the terms were favorable and the paperwork was clean and I didn't push. Tell me that investor is not, I don't know. His voice was tight. I genuinely do not know. Daewon closed his folder. He was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that precedes something being said that cannot be unsaid. Taehyun, if she is a shareholder in the Cayman Holding Company, even an anonymous one, then she has legal standing as a financial stakeholder in every subsidiary that flows from it, which means the accounts in Singapore, the shell companies in Hong Kong, the Penthouse Trust. He paused. She may have the legal right to call certain instruments due. Taehyun heard this. He understood it. He stood with it for 3 seconds inside his own chest, and then he moved. He walked across the courtroom with the long, controlled strides of a man who had spent his life making sure that when he entered a space, people understood that the space now belonged to him. He stopped at the edge of Imani's table. Attorney Beck looked up. The diplomat nearest the table took a single step forward, not aggressive, just present, and Taehyun stopped just short of the invisible line that step defined. Imani looked up from the phone. She didn't startle, she didn't brace, she just looked at him with those steady dark eyes and waited. This is a negotiation, he said. Everything that just happened, the ceremony, the documents, the guards, that's theater. You want something. Everyone in a room like this wants something, so tell me what it is. She looked at him for a moment. I told you in the hallway. Forget the hallway. We're past that. You've shown your hand. Now tell me the number. There's no number, Taehyun. Everyone has a number. You believe that because it's been true of everyone you've dealt with. She set the phone down on the table, face down, with a small, precise click. I'm not negotiating a settlement. I'm asking a court to make a legal determination about a marriage that actually ended, a long time before today. The bank, he said, the investment stake. You knew what you were doing when you structured that. Something moved across her face. Not guilt. Something more complicated than guilt. I structured a legitimate institutional investment 3 years ago because it met our criteria for emerging market engagement. The fact that my husband was the beneficial owner of the receiving entity was something I disclosed to our board and managed at arm's length. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. You bought into my company. My bank made an investment. I recused myself from the decision-making process precisely because of the conflict of interest. A pause. I followed every protocol, Taehyun. That's what you never understood about me. I always followed the protocols. He stared at her. That's a very clean story. It's the true one. Why? The word came out harder than he intended, raw in a way he hadn't planned. If you had all of this, the title, the bank, the resources, why did you stay? Why any of it? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Because I loved you, she said. No decoration, no pause for effect, just that, flat and real and utterly without apology. And then I didn't anymore. And then I had to decide what to do about that. He felt the words land somewhere he didn't have a name for, and he covered it the only way he knew how, which was to move immediately to the next thing. The loan, he said. The private credit instrument on the Cayman entity. You hold that note. The Royal Bank of Canberra holds that note. You control the bank. I am one voice on a board of 11. Don't. His voice was sharp. Don't do the technical answer. You and I both know what you have standing to do with that instrument. If you call it, I'm aware of what I have standing to do. Then you understand what I'm telling you. There is a version of this where we both walk away intact. Your documentation is in the record. Fine. Your identity is established. Fine. Take what the prenuptial agreement entitles you to, and we close this. And the Singapore accounts, the shell companies, the penthouse your mistress is living in, purchased with funds routed through entities I can trace to 3 separate instances of financial irregularity? She wasn't raising her voice. She was reciting. Those stay buried. Those are my business. They were conducted through instruments my bank financed. They are also my business. The recess door opened. The court officer appeared. The judge is returning. Taehyun didn't move for a moment. He and Amani looked at each other across the narrow space of a table in a fluorescent room in a building that smelled of recycled air. He had spent 11 years in proximity to this woman, and he had never once had a conversation with her that felt like this. Like two people of exactly equivalent weight finally pressing against each other without the pretense of imbalance. He hated it. He hated how much he recognized it. He went back to his seat. The judge entered. The room resettled into procedural form. Attorney Dae-won had assembled a revised position in the intervening time, a challenge to the diplomatic documentation's jurisdiction over domestic family court proceedings, a request for authentication delay, a motion to bifurcate the asset discussion from the marital dissolution question, all of it legally defensible, all of it time-buying. The judge listened to each motion with the careful neutrality of a person who had already formed an opinion and was giving the process its due before acting on it. He denied the authentication delay. He granted limited bifurcation. He ruled that the diplomatic documentation was admissible and would stand in the record pending formal verification through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which he noted had already been contacted during the recess and had confirmed the authenticity of the Kingdom of Canberra's diplomatic mission in Seoul. Dae-won made a note. His pen moved quickly and without emphasis, the way a person writes when they're processing faster than they want to show. Then Attorney Baek rose again. He rose with the measured unhurriedness of a man who had been practicing law for 56 years and had never once felt the need to rush a moment he had prepared carefully for. He straightened his dated jacket. He picked up the folder that had been sitting to his right since the proceedings began, closed, untouched during all of the previous activity. He set it in front of the clerk. "Your Honor," he said, "the respondent wishes to enter a final set of documentation into the record at this time." Dae-won was on his feet. "The petitioner requests a summary of course," Beck said, with the graciousness of a man offering something he was going to provide regardless. He opened his folder. He read from the first page without theater, without pause, in the clear, unhurried voice of someone reciting facts they have known for a very long time. This documentation represents the results of a 3-year independent financial audit commissioned by the Royal Bank of Canberra into the use of institutional investment funds dispersed to entities in which the petitioner holds beneficial ownership. The room changed again. Differently this time. Less like weather shifting and more like a floor giving way. Gradual, then sudden. The audit identifies 17 instances of fund diversion, Bayek continued, across a period of 38 months. Totaling in aggregate the equivalent of 412 million Korean won, redirected from legitimate corporate operational accounts to personal expenditure accounts and third-party transfer recipients. He turned a page. The audit further identifies a pattern of default on the private credit instrument issued by the Royal Bank of Canberra to the Cayman holding entity, with 3 scheduled payments missed over the preceding 14 months, none of which were disclosed to the institutional lender. The room was very quiet. "As legal holder of that credit instrument," Beck said, and his voice was the quietest it had been all morning, "the Royal Bank of Canberra, represented today by its controlling principal, Princess Imani Adebayo Okoye, is formally calling the outstanding loan balance due. Tae-hyun heard the number. It wasn't a large number in the scale of the things he had built. It was not the number that mattered. What mattered was the word due. What mattered was the legal mechanism that word activated. The collateral clauses in the credit instrument, the cross-default provisions that linked the Cayman entity's default to every subsidiary in its structure, the cascade of financial exposure that a called loan set in motion in the space of the time it took a judge to read a motion and grant it. He looked at Daewon. Daewon was not looking at him. Daewon was reading the document the clerk had just passed to him, and his face had gone the careful blank of a man who has just calculated something and doesn't want the number he reached to be visible. Tae-hyun looked at Harin. She was looking at her phone. His phone buzzed against his thigh through the fabric of his suit jacket. He couldn't take it out. He was in a courtroom. It buzzed again and again. 3 separate contacts, which meant 3 separate sources of the same information, which meant it was already moving through his network faster than he could control it. He sat still. He breathed. He was Kang Tae-hyun, and he had survived things that would break ordinary men, and he was going to sit in this courtroom chair, and he was going to breathe, and he was going to find the next move. The judge was speaking. Legal language, procedural language, the language of a process moving forward along its track. Imani sat at her table with her hands folded and her hair down and her cheap shoes flat on the courthouse floor. She was not watching him. She was watching the judge, listening with the focused attention of someone for whom this is simply the next item on a long list of things that need to be done correctly. And that was when Tae-hyun understood, fully, finally, in the way that understanding sometimes requires the ground to be completely gone before it arrives, that she had not come to this courtroom today to win. She had come to finish something. There was a difference, and it was the difference between a person who wants to defeat you and a person who simply needs to be done with you. And the second kind is the one you cannot negotiate with, cannot intimidate, cannot redirect, because they are not operating from want. They are operating from necessity. His phone buzzed a 4th time, and then a 5th, and in the pocket of his charcoal suit, in the middle of a courthouse where a process was unfolding that he could no longer stop, Kang Tae-hyun sat with the stillness of a man who has just realized that every exit from this room leads to a smaller room, and that the woman across from him had been quietly, carefully, and without any visible emotion whatsoever, building those walls for a very long time. The phone buzzed a 6th time, and Tae-hyun reached into his jacket pocket and pressed the side button to silence it without looking at the screen, which was the last act of controlled behavior he would manage for the next several hours. The judge was still speaking. The procedural language continued its forward movement, scheduling, verification timelines, notification requirements for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All of it correct and orderly, and completely indifferent to the fact that Kang Tae-hyun's empire was making a sound inside his chest like a building settling wrong. The kind of sound that architects know means something structural has shifted, something that cannot be unshifted. Daewon leaned over. His voice was barely breath. The cross-default provisions. Tell me you know the exact language. I know the exact language. Then you know what a called loan triggers in the subsidiary chain. Yes. How fast? Tae-hyun looked at the table surface. Within the business day. The Singapore accounts first. Then the Hong Kong entities. The Cayman Holding Company goes into technical default the moment the Seoul courts acknowledge the loan call, which... He stopped. The judge was still talking. The judge was, in fact, at this moment, formally acknowledging receipt of the loan call documentation and entering it into the court record, which meant the acknowledgement was happening in real time, which meant the clock had already started. He stood up. Daewon grabbed his sleeve. You cannot... Recess! Tae-hyun's voice came out at a volume he hadn't intended. The judge stopped mid-sentence. Every head in the room turned. I need to request an emergency recess. 30 minutes. The judge looked at him with the measured expression of a man who has presided over enough proceedings to recognize when a party is unraveling and has decided to let the process manage it. The petitioner may address the court through his counsel. Your Honor. Daewon was on his feet with the reflexive professionalism of a man who had spent his career cleaning up after other men's impulses. The petitioner requests a brief recess to consult with counsel on matters directly relevant to the documentation just entered. A pause. 15 minutes, the judge said. He rose. The room rose. Taehyun was already moving toward the door before the gavel touched the block. The hallway was bright and indifferent. He moved past the security station, past a woman with a stroller who looked up, and then quickly away from something in his face and into the men's restroom at the end of the corridor. He locked the door. He turned on the tap. He put both hands on the edge of the sink and looked at the water running over the drain for 6 seconds before he looked up at his own face in the mirror. He had looked at himself in mirrors his whole adult life with the specific gaze of a man checking a weapon before use, checking that it was presentable, that it communicated what it needed to communicate, that it was ready. He looked at himself now and did not recognize the function. He took out his phone. 9 missed calls. 4 from his chief financial officer, Park Jin-soo. 2 from his head of legal compliance. 1 from a number he didn't have saved, which he would identify later as belonging to a journalist from a major financial news outlet who had apparently already received a tip. 1 from his personal security chief, and 1 from a number he did know, his younger brother Kang Tae-min, who worked inside the legitimate corporate arm of the organization and who called Tae-hyun approximately 4 times a year and never about business. He called Jin-soo first. Jin-soo picked up on half a ring. The Singapore accounts are frozen. His voice had the flat rapidity of a man delivering damage reports. FSS notification came through 12 minutes ago. Financial Services Commission has been contacted by a foreign institutional creditor presenting a cross-default claim. Our compliance team is saying it's procedurally valid. We can challenge the speed of execution, but we cannot challenge the underlying legal basis. How much is frozen? All of it. Every account in the Singapore structure. 68,400,000 and I know the number, Hong Kong. Not yet. But if Singapore moved this fast, Hong Kong follows within the hour. Jin-soo paused. Sir, our primary operating account for the Seoul corporate offices, the account we use for payroll, for vendor contracts, for all legitimate business operations. It feeds from the Singapore structure. Taehyun said nothing. We have 11 days of operational liquidity without a Singapore transfer, Jin-soo said. After that, we cannot make payroll. He ended the call. He stood at the sink with the water still running and his phone in his hand, and he thought about the 11 people who had called him this morning to tell him variations of the same thing, and he thought about the lawyer in the courtroom who had been practicing for 56 years and had handed documents to a judge with the patience of a man who had been building toward this moment for a long time. And he thought about a woman in a gray cardigan who had once been a graduate student with a second-hand laptop and 3 roommates, and how that story had never once felt wrong because she had never once needed it to feel right. She had simply lived it. She had simply been a person and allowed him to misread her, and had never, in 11 years, given him a single reason to look again. He splashed water on his face. It was cold, and it did not help, and he did it again anyway. He called his security chief next. The call lasted 90 seconds. What he learned was that 2 vehicles from the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit had been observed parking outside the Black Dragon Syndicate's primary corporate headquarters on Tehran Row 30 minutes ago. Not raiding. Observing. The particular kind of observing that precedes action, the kind that sends a message before the message is officially sent. He ended that call too. He looked at himself in the mirror one more time. He straightened his jacket. He fixed his collar. He went back to the courtroom. The 15 minutes had not elapsed, but Daewon was standing near the doorway waiting for him with the focused tension of a man who has received his own phone calls. He pulled Tae-hyun into the alcove beside the courtroom entrance and spoke at a velocity that was not his normal register. The Hong Kong registrar has received a creditor notification. The shell companies are being flagged for compliance review. It hasn't frozen yet, but it will, and when it does, the cross-default chain completes. He paused for breath. More pressing. I just received a call from a contact at the Seoul Central Prosecutor's Office. They have received a referral. Financial Crimes Division. The referral came from the court record, specifically from the audit documentation Beck submitted. The audit identifies, and I am quoting, systematic patterns of fund diversion consistent with money laundering and embezzlement under Articles 3 and 8 of the Act on Reporting and Using Specified Financial Transaction Information. Taehyun processed this. They'd need to investigate before, They've been investigating, Daewon's voice dropped. Taehyun. The referral came with a supplementary brief. The prosecutors already have a case file. This wasn't opened today. This was opened 18 months ago. He paused. The audit Baek presented. Someone provided preliminary findings to the prosecutors before today. Someone started this process a year and a half ago. Taehyun went very still. Baek's client. That would be my assumption. He turned and looked through the narrow window in the courtroom door. Imani was at her table. Attorney Baek was beside her. One of the diplomats was standing at her shoulder, showing her something on a tablet, and she was nodding, not with the urgent nodding of someone receiving alarming news, but the measured nodding of someone confirming that a thing they expected to happen has happened on schedule. She's been coordinating with the prosecutors for 18 months, he said. He wasn't asking. That is what I believe the evidence suggests. While living in my house. Daewon didn't answer that. While attending my events. While sitting at my table. He turned away from the window. She built the prosecution case from inside my household. I would be careful about framing it that way, Daewon said carefully. Legally, reporting financial irregularities to authorities is not. I know what it is legally. He cut the sentence off. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, a gesture so uncharacteristic that Daewon visibly noticed it and looked away, giving him the professional courtesy of privacy. Taehyun lowered his hand. How bad is it? A long pause. The audit covers 38 months and identifies 412 million won in diverted funds. The prosecutorial brief, if it mirrors the audit, will contain documentation sufficient to charge. The question is additional evidence. Daewon chose his next words with the care of a man navigating between two bad options. If she has been providing the prosecutors with information for 18 months, and if she had access to your household communications, your calendar, your business correspondence, she didn't have access to... He stopped. He thought about this. He thought about 11 years of a woman who was quiet and self-contained and had no apparent interest in his business, who handled the household, who managed the domestic staff, who received his mail when he was traveling and sorted it without comment, and left anything business-related on his desk unopened. The domestic correspondence, he said. Daewon waited. Some vendor communications came to the house, routine things. But 3 years ago, when I restructured the Cayman entity, the initial incorporation documents were sent to the residential address. I remember because I was traveling and I asked her to receive the package. Did you ask her to sign for it? She would have needed to. So she saw the name of the registering firm. Yes, but that name alone doesn't... A person with sufficient banking resources and sufficient motivation could trace a law firm's incorporation client from the firm's name and the date of filing in a public registry, Daewon said. It takes money and patience. She appears to have had both. The hallway felt different than it had during the first recess. The same fluorescent lights, the same recycled air, the same board security officer near the main entrance. But the quality of the space had changed in the way that spaces change when you understand that you have been inside something you thought was neutral and have discovered it was not. He had been living in her operation. For 3 years, at minimum, possibly longer, he had been a subject of an investigation being conducted from inside his own home by the woman who cooked in his kitchen and slept in the room down the hall and attended his events and smiled at appropriate moments. And he had never known. The courtroom door opened. The court officer looked out. Judge is returning. They went back inside. Harin had moved her chair fractionally away from the petitioner's table during the recess. Taehyun noticed this the moment he sat. The 3 or 4 centimeters of additional space she had created between herself and the position she'd occupied all morning. He noticed it, and he filed it, and he said nothing. The proceedings resumed. The judge addressed the outstanding motions with the calm efficiency of someone clearing a work surface. Daewon's authentication delay had been denied. The bifurcation was acknowledged, but limited in scope. The loan call documentation stood. Then the judge said something that changed the architecture of the room again. The court has received a formal request from the Seoul Central Prosecutor's Office to place a hold on any asset transfers or dissolution orders pending the conclusion of a financial crimes investigation. This request is granted. All asset matters related to the marital estate will be stayed pending prosecutorial review. He looked at both tables with equal and impersonal attention. The dissolution petition itself may proceed on its own timeline. The court will schedule a continuation hearing. At this time, the door opened. Not the formal knock from earlier. This was a different entry. Two men in civilian clothes with identification already presented to the court officer at the door, moving with the contained urgency of people who have a specific task and intend to complete it regardless of what is currently in progress. Financial Intelligence Unit. The identification was visible for only a moment, but Tae-hyun had worked adjacent to law enforcement long enough to read the format in the half-second it was displayed. One of the men spoke to the court officer in a low voice. The court officer approached the judge. There was a brief exchange. The judge looked at Tae-hyun. The court will stand in brief recess, the judge said. The petitioner is requested to remain in the courtroom. Daewon was on his feet. Your Honor, any communication with my client must be— Counsel is, of course, present, the judge said. He rose. Almost everyone else rose with him. The FIU officers moved to positions that were technically neutral and effectively not. Tae-hyun sat. Harin stood. She picked up her purse. She looked at Tae-hyun for one moment. Not a long moment. Not a moment heavy with the weight of shared history or guilt or affection. Just a moment of pure assessment. The gaze of a person determining whether to stay or go and having already decided. And she walked toward the door. Harin. His voice was quiet. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her face had the particular composition of a woman who has been performing an emotion for a long time and has run out of reasons to continue the performance. I'm sorry, she said. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded like a person who has rehearsed the words for a situation they hoped wouldn't arrive and is now using them because the situation has arrived, and the words are all they have prepared. I think I'm going to go. The penthouse is in the court record, he said. Your name is in the record. You cannot— I have an attorney, she said. I've had one for 3 weeks. He stared at her. 3 weeks? I'm going to cooperate with whatever they need. My attorney says it's the correct approach. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder, a small mechanical gesture that her hands performed while the rest of her waited for the conversation to be over. I didn't know it would go this far. I want you to know that. I genuinely didn't know. You retained an attorney 3 weeks ago. He said it slowly, giving each word its own space. 3 weeks ago, this proceeding hadn't started yet. Harin looked at him. Her eyes did that moving thing again, the rapid internal calculation he had noticed earlier and filed away. Someone contacted me, she said, 6 weeks ago. An attorney from a firm I didn't know. They explained that there was going to be a legal proceeding and that I had exposure and that I should retain independent counsel. Who contacted you? She was quiet for a moment. The attorney identified themselves as representing the Royal Bank of Canberra. The cold in Tae-hyun's chest reached a temperature he had no previous experience with. Amani had contacted Harin 6 weeks before the divorce filing, 6 weeks before the courthouse, 6 weeks before the kneeling guard and the diplomatic papers and the loan call. Amani had sent an attorney to his mistress and given her the opportunity to protect herself. She had given Harin the same opportunity she had given him in the hallway, and Harin, unlike him, had taken it. Get out, he said. Not loudly, just factually, the way he had said everything today, and Harin left, and the door closed behind her, and Tae-hyun sat in the courtroom with the FIU officers at either end of the space, and Daewon beside him writing something on his notepad, and Attorney Bayek across the room sitting with his hands folded, and Amani beside Bayek, looking at no one, patient as stone. The FIU officer who had spoken to the court officer approached the table. He placed a document in front of Daewon. He did not look at Tae-hyun while he did it, which was either professional courtesy or deliberate diminishment. Tae-hyun couldn't decide which was worse. Daewon read the document. His face did not change, but his breathing changed, which Tae-hyun caught because he was watching for exactly that. They've issued a provisional asset restraint order, Daewon said. His voice was steady because that was what Tae-hyun paid him for. All assets connected to the Kong corporate structure, domestic and international, are restrained pending formal investigation. This includes, he continued reading, personal accounts, residential properties, and business interests in the petitioner's name or beneficially controlled by the petitioner. On what basis? On the basis of the audit documentation submitted to the court record today and a supplementary evidentiary brief filed by the Seoul Central Prosecutor's Office this morning at 9:47. Daewon paused. 9:47, 40 minutes before the hearing began. They had filed before the hearing. They had filed while Tae-hyun was in the car on the way to the courthouse, certain of a straightforward victory. The prosecutors had filed their brief while he was adjusting his cufflinks in the back seat of his car. The corporate accounts, Tae-hyun said. Personal liquidity. Restrained. The Gangnam apartment. Restrained. My personal shit, all of it, Tae-hyun, all of it is restrained. Daewon set down the document and looked at him directly for the first time since the proceedings had started. You need to understand what I'm telling you. As of this moment, you cannot access funds. You cannot transfer assets. You cannot liquidate holdings. You are, for the duration of this investigation, functionally. He stopped. He was a man who chose his words with precision, and he was choosing these with particular care. You have no liquidity. Tae-hyun looked at the table surface. The grain of the wood, the small circular mark near the edge where someone's coffee cup had rested without a coaster. He looked at these things because they were real and fixed and did not shift while he looked at them. He had built an empire. He had spent 15 years building something that could not be touched, could not be reached, could not be threatened by anything that operated inside legal frameworks, because he had been so meticulous about the distance between his legitimate face and his operational reality. He had been more careful than anyone he knew. He had made mistakes, the penthouse, some of the routing decisions, the Cayman Incorporation document sent to the wrong address. But these were minor errors, the kind that well-resourced defense teams could manage given sufficient time and sufficient motivation. He had not accounted for the possibility that the person closest to him had been watching for 3 years and had resources that exceeded his own. He looked up. Across the room, one of the diplomats had leaned down to say something to Amani. She listened, nodded once, and returned her gaze to the middle distance. Her reading glasses were folded on the table. Her hair was still down. The royal guard stood at their measured distance. None of it had the appearance of victory. It had the appearance of procedure, of a thing being completed methodically by people who had planned for it carefully and were now executing the plan. The court officer appeared from the judge's chamber. The judge is prepared to return. The judge returned. He reviewed the FIU document on the record. He formally noted the asset restraint order and its implications for the dissolution proceedings. He issued a continuance date, 30 days, for the marital dissolution hearing, pending the prosecutorial timeline. He addressed both tables with the equal opportunity neutrality of the Korean family court system. Then he said, with the unremarkable delivery of a person closing a meeting, the court thanks the diplomatic mission of the Kingdom of Canberra for their cooperation with this proceeding and wishes the representative party safe travel. He rose. The room rose. Tae-hyun stood with everyone else, and in the standing he felt the full weight of what his legs were holding. Not just the physical weight, which had not changed, but the weight of the morning and everything the morning had revealed and destroyed and reduced. He stood, and his suit still fit perfectly, and his shoes were still expensive, and his face still held its controlled and practiced arrangement, and none of it corresponded to anything real anymore. It was a costume. He was wearing a costume of a man who had power, and the man who had power had ceased to exist somewhere between 9:47 this morning and right now. The room began to move toward exit. The diplomats gathered their document cases. The royal guards moved with practiced coordination. Attorney Baek was gathering his folders with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done everything he came to do. Amani stood. She picked up her reading glasses and put them back on. She picked up the paper coffee cup, which was long empty, and looked for a moment as though she was going to set it down on the table. And then, with the small decision of someone who has grown up understanding that you clean up after yourself, she held on to it to throw away on the way out. She exchanged a few words with the lead diplomat. She put on her cardigan, which had been draped over the back of her chair, pushing each button through its hole with unhurried fingers. She was leaving. The hearing was over. She was going to walk out of this room in her faded cardigan and her flat shoes, and she was going to get into a vehicle that probably bore diplomatic plates, and she was going to return to whatever her life actually was, the life he had never asked about, never investigated, never taken seriously enough to be curious about, and Tae-hyun understood that this was the thing he could not recover from. Not the frozen accounts, not the prosecution brief, not even the prospect of criminal charges, which his mind had not fully arrived at yet because it was still processing everything before it. He could not recover from having been the kind of man who never asked. He moved. He didn't plan it. His body made the decision before his mind signed off on it, which was the second time today that it happened, and both times had been in response to Imani. He crossed the space between the tables in 5 steps, and he said her name. She turned. They stood 3 feet apart in a clearing courthouse room with people moving around them and the fluorescent lights doing their indifferent work overhead. He looked at her face, the same face, the face he had looked at across tables and in hallways and in the early mornings for 11 years. And he understood that he had never actually seen it. He had seen what he expected to see. He had seen what was useful to him. He had seen a woman who confirmed a story he was already telling about himself. And when the story changed, he had discarded her without curiosity about what he might be discarding. "Why the cardigan?" he said. It was not what he planned to say. He hadn't planned anything. Why any of it? The shoes, the apartment, the way you could have had anything. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her face that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite sorrow and wasn't quite the satisfaction of having been right. It was something more exhausted and more honest than any of those things. "Because," she said, "I wanted to know if you could love a woman who had nothing, and I got my answer." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. The same small mechanical gesture Harin had made, the gesture of a person signaling that a conversation is complete. "Take care of yourself, Tae-hyun." She walked past him toward the door. The lead diplomat held it open. The royal guards moved. The diplomats moved. Attorney Bayek moved with the dignified efficiency of a man who had done excellent work and was now going home. The door closed. Tae-hyun stood in the middle of the emptying courtroom, and the court officer was looking at him from near the judge's bench, and Daewon was at his elbow, saying something about next steps, and the FIU officers were still near the entrance with their neutral positioning, and somewhere in Seoul, his office phones were ringing and his network was fracturing, and his accounts were frozen, and his mistress had retained counsel 6 weeks ago, and his wife, had just walked out in a faded cardigan and flat shoes, the same way she had walked into everything for 11 years, with a dignity so complete it required no announcement and no defense. And in the courtroom doorway, before the door finished closing, he saw through the narrowing gap the lead diplomat leaning down to say something to Imani as they moved into the hallway, and he saw her nod once, and he saw the absolute absence of triumph in her posture, the posture of someone who had completed a difficult and necessary task, and felt perhaps only the particular hollowness of being finished. The door clicked shut. Daewon's voice reached him. "We need to talk about the criminal exposure, today. Before they move from provisional restraint to formal charges, we need to—" "Tae-hyun, are you listening to me?" Tae-hyun turned to face his attorney. Daewon's eyes were doing the calculations. The professional machinery was running. Tae-hyun looked at this man who had kept him operational for 15 years through a combination of genuine legal skill and the kind of willful selective ignorance that well-paid attorneys sometimes practice. And he saw that the selective ignorance was gone now, burned away by a morning that had stripped every layer of deniable distance from everything. "Tell me," Tae-hyun said, "what I need to do to survive this." Not win, survive. It was the first honest question he had asked in a very long time, and the asking of it cost him something he couldn't name, something located in the part of a person that confuses invulnerability with strength, and had to lose one to find out it never had the other. Daewon had a conference room booked 3 blocks from the courthouse, in a building that housed 4 mid-sized law firms and an accounting practice, and had the particular smell of places where bad news gets delivered in professional language. They were there within 20 minutes of leaving the courtroom. Daewon had made 6 calls during the walk. Tae-hyun had made none. He had carried his phone in his hand and watched the screen light up with numbers he recognized and numbers he didn't, and he had let all of it go to voicemail because he needed 10 minutes of not receiving information before he could do anything useful with the next piece of it. The conference room had a long table and 8 chairs and a window that looked at the side of another building. Daewon's junior associate, a young man named Seo, who had the tightly wound energy of someone operating on insufficient sleep, had already spread documents across the table by the time they arrived. Taehyun looked at the spread of papers and felt a profound and unfamiliar exhaustion move through him from the back of his skull down to his feet. He sat anyway. He put his phone face down on the table. He looked at Daewon. "All of it," he said. Daewon sat across from him and opened his folder and began. The criminal exposure had three distinct layers. The first was the financial crimes case, the audit findings, the fund diversion pattern, the defaulted loan, and the cross-default cascade. This was the cleanest layer to understand and the most immediately dangerous, because the documentation was complete and had been submitted to a court record that was now public. The prosecutors didn't need to build this case. It had been handed to them, built, documented, and filed. The second layer was organized crime exposure. The Black Dragon Syndicate's connection to Taehyun had been an open secret in certain circles for years, but open secrets and prosecutable evidence were different animals. The financial audit, however, had created a thread, and threads, pulled with sufficient legal authority, unraveled things. If the prosecutors followed the fund diversion documentation back through the subsidiary chain, they would reach the operational accounts of the syndicate itself. Daewon paused here and looked at Taehyun with the direct gaze of a man asking a question without speaking it. Taehyun answered the unspoken question. "Yes, there's exposure." Daewon made a note. He continued. The third layer was the one that made Seo, the junior associate, go very still at his end of the table. International jurisdiction, the Singapore accounts, the Hong Kong entities, the Cayman Holding Company. These were not domestic instruments. A called loan from a sovereign institutional creditor in a foreign jurisdiction, combined with a financial crimes referral and the involvement of a diplomatic mission, created conditions under which international financial crime frameworks could be invoked. Interpol notification was not guaranteed but was possible. Asset recovery mechanisms under international treaty could be activated. "In plain language," Taehyun said. "In plain language," Daewon said, "you could be looking at prosecution in multiple jurisdictions, asset seizure beyond what domestic courts can order, and a timeline that extends well past any domestic resolution." He paused. "And you would be looking at all of this while functionally illiquid." The room was quiet for a moment. "The defense fund," Taehyun said. "I have a reserve account that isn't connected to the corporate structure." Daewon looked at him. "Is it in your name?" A pause. "A family member's name." "A family member whose name appears anywhere in the corporate documentation." Taehyun thought about this. He thought about Taemin, his brother, who had called once this morning and worked in the legitimate corporate arm and whose name appeared on exactly 3 internal documents as a subsidiary officer. Potentially. Then potentially restrained. Daewon closed his folder. "Taehyun, I have to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." "Ask." "Is there anything, any asset, any account, any holding that has no connection whatsoever to the corporate structure and no connection to your name or any family member's name?" Taehyun thought about this for a long time. He thought through 15 years of construction, layering, insulation, the careful architecture of a man who had always believed that complexity was protection. He thought through every account, every property, every instrument, and the answer assembled itself slowly, with the particular horror of an answer that arrives through elimination. "No," he said. Daewon nodded once. He had expected this answer. He had the look of a man who had been expecting it since the hallway outside the courtroom, and had been hoping to be wrong. "Then we focus on cooperation strategy," Daewon said. "We approach the prosecutors before they move from provisional to formal charges. We present a willingness to cooperate on the organized crime elements in exchange for a structured resolution on the financial crimes. Taehyun's phone lit up. He had put it face down, but the vibration moved it and it tilted, and he could see the screen. The call was from a number he hadn't seen in 4 years. A man named Oh Jae-sung, who ran a rival organization in Busan and who had been, for the past 6 years, held in a careful and mutually profitable distance from the Black Dragon Syndicate's territory by the specific weight of Taehyun's reputation. Oh Jae-sung was calling him. That was the moment Taehyun understood that the news of his morning had already left the courthouse and entered the ecosystem where it would do its most immediate damage. Oh wasn't calling to express sympathy. Oh was calling because the weight had lifted and he wanted to know what was available. He turned the phone face down again. "Continue," he said to Daiwan. The cooperation approach requires you to provide actionable intelligence on the syndicate's operational structure. Specifically, on individuals above you in the network hierarchy. There's no one above me. Then on operational lieutenants, on financial conduits, on specific transaction histories that the prosecutors can use to build secondary cases. Daiwan paused. This will have consequences within the organization. The organization is already fracturing. He said it flatly, without grief, because grief was not a useful tool right now, and he had spent his adult life not using tools that weren't useful. Oh, Jae-sung just called me. By tonight, every rival structure in Seoul will have the morning's news. The operational lieutenants will be calculating their own survival. They won't wait to see what I do. Then move first, Daewon said. Move before they do. His phone lit up again. Different number. One of his own lieutenants, a man named Hwang, who ran the syndicate's investment arm, and who had, until this morning, been one of 3 people Tae-hyun trusted with the full scope of the operational finances. Hwang was calling from a personal number, not an operational line. Using a personal number was a message. It meant Hwang was already separating himself from the structure. Tae-hyun picked up the phone this time. He accepted the call and put it to his ear and said nothing. He waited. I need to know, Hwang said, what you want me to do with the Incheon documentation. The Incheon documentation was a set of physical files, ledgers, transaction records, correspondence, maintained in a secure facility near the port. They were the most complete record of the syndicate's operational finances in existence. They had never been digitized. They existed in physical form because Tae-hyun had always believed that digital records were too easily accessed, and physical records, stored correctly, were controllable. Touch nothing, Tae-hyun said. A pause. The prosecutors? Touch nothing until I tell you otherwise. Another pause. Longer. I've had 2 calls this morning from people asking about the Incheon access protocol. People with standing to ask. Who? Hwang named 2 men. Both of them were senior in the syndicate's structure. Both of them were men who had worked alongside Tae-hyun for over a decade. Both of them, Hwang's tone made clear, were asking about the access protocol because they were considering using it, not to preserve the documentation but to move it, or destroy it. I'll handle it, Tae-hyun said. He ended the call. Daewon was watching him. So was Seo, with the helpless attention of a young man who is watching something operate at a velocity he can observe but cannot yet fully process. The Incheon documentation, Tae-hyun said to Daewon. Daewon's expression shifted fractionally. He knew enough about the organization's structure to understand the reference. If it's compromised before the prosecutors access it, then they build their case from the audit alone, which is substantial but limited in scope. If they access Incheon intact, he stopped. Then the scope is unlimited, Daewon said. Yes. So the question is whether you control what they get. Tae-hyun looked at the window, the side of the other building. Gray concrete and 2 small windows and a drain pipe. The most neutral view he had ever seen in his life, and he was grateful for it. If I hand them Incheon, he said slowly, on my terms, through my attorney, as a voluntary cooperation gesture, you control the framing, you demonstrate good faith before charges are filed. You potentially mitigate the organized crime exposure by being the source rather than the subject. Daewon's voice had found a new register, not the defensive posturing of the courtroom, but something more direct. The voice of a man who is finally able to speak frankly because the room has run out of things to pretend. It is the single most significant leverage point you have, and you have a narrow window to use it before someone else makes the decision for you. Tae-hyun's phone was on the table and it had not stopped moving. He could feel each vibration through the table surface like a small repeated percussion. The network was alive with the morning's events, and everyone in it was making calculations, and the calculations were all arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. The weight was gone, the structure was compromised, and the only question was what could be recovered from the collapse. He thought about Oh Jae-sung in Busan, who had held his territory at careful distance for 6 years because of a reputation that was now, by the end of this business day, going to be worth considerably less than it had been this morning. He thought about Hwang and the 2 men who had called about the Incheon access protocol and what it meant that men he had worked with for a decade were making those calls before noon on the day his accounts were frozen. He thought about Ha Rin, who had retained counsel 6 weeks ago, and would cooperate with prosecutors and would emerge from this with immunity and her carefully constructed self intact because she had accepted an opportunity when it was offered. He thought about Imani, who had offered him the same opportunity in a courthouse hallway, and watched him laugh in her face. He picked up his phone. He called Huang back. "The Incheon facility," he said when Huang answered. "No one enters. No one touches the documentation. I am placing you personally responsible for its integrity until I send someone with written authorization. If anyone attempts to access it without that authorization, you call me directly." He paused. "And Huang, the two men who called you this morning, don't take their calls." A silence. Then, "Understood." He ended the call. He looked at Daiwan. He did not cry during this call. But when it ended, he sat with the phone in his hand for 4 minutes without moving, which was its own kind of thing. The second thing he did was prepare. He sat with Daiwan and Seo, and he went through what he knew and what he could document and what his cooperation could provide. And he did it with the thoroughness of a man who had learned a long time ago that the difference between an asset and a liability was almost always preparation. Chief Prosecutor Lim looked at him across the conference table with the careful attention of someone who had read his file and formed an opinion and was now testing the opinion against the person. She had a folder in front of her that she didn't open. She didn't need to open it. She knew what was in it. "Voluntary cooperation is noted," she said. Her voice was level and professional and gave nothing away about whether the note was meaningful or performative. "We'll hear what you have." Taehyun looked at her. He had sat across from adversaries his entire adult life, and he had learned to read them quickly, their hunger, their leverage, their actual position beneath their stated one. Lim Jae-young was not hungry. She didn't need him. She had the audit documentation, and she had the court record, and she had whatever Harin's attorney had been preparing for 6 weeks. And she was here because Daiwan had offered something she was willing to spend 40 minutes evaluating. "Incheon," Taehyun said. Lim's expression didn't change, but the quality of her stillness changed. She had known the word was coming. She was too well prepared not to have known. But knowing and hearing were different, and the hearing of it told her something about the seriousness of his position. "We're aware of the facility," she said. "You're aware it exists. You don't have access." "We'll have access through standard warrant procedure within 48 to 72 hours, Taehyun said, "in which time the documentation becomes vulnerable to the people who currently have physical access and who have spent this morning making calls about the access protocol. You know what's in that facility. You know what it represents to your case. The question is whether you get it intact or whether you spend the next 18 months reconstructing from fragments what I can hand you complete this afternoon." Lim was quiet for a long moment. "What are you asking for?" "Structured resolution on the financial crimes. I am not asking for dismissal. I am not asking for immunity. I'm asking for a defined scope, charges that reflect the documented conduct, not an expansive interpretation of every adjacent liability. I am asking for the organized crime exposure to be addressed as a function of cooperation rather than prosecution." He paused. "And I am asking to be the one who opens Incheon, not the one who gets opened by it." Another silence. Lim looked at Park. Park's pen had stopped. "The international elements are not within our exclusive jurisdiction," Lim said carefully. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to dismiss international exposure. I'm asking you to be on record as the primary jurisdiction, which gives you standing to shape how the international elements are handled." Lim looked at him with the expression of someone revising an assessment mid-conversation. Not warmly, not with sympathy, but with the professional recognition of a person who has just received more than they expected from a source they had expected to receive less from. "I'll need to consult with the director," she said. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning," Taehyun said. "Someone may have already made the decision for both of us about Incheon." Lim looked at him. She looked at Daewon. She made a decision that Taehyun could watch happen in real time, not in her expression, which barely moved, but in the way she shifted her weight and reached for her folder with the particular deliberateness of someone committing to an action. "Give us 30 minutes. She left the room with Park. Taehyun and Daewon sat alone in the conference room with the bad coffee and the austerity and the faint sounds of a working office outside the door. Daewon poured water from a pitcher on the table and pushed a glass toward Taehyun without comment. Taehyun drank it. The water was room temperature and slightly stale, and it was the best thing he'd had all day. If they say yes, Daewon said, then we drive to Incheon tonight and I unlock the facility personally, and we hand them the documentation with a full inventory, and I give a formal cooperation statement. Taehyun set down the glass. And then we see what's left. And if they say no, Taehyun looked at the door. Then someone reaches Incheon before we do, and the question becomes moot. They sat with this. The office sounds continued outside. A phone ringing, answered quickly. Footsteps in a corridor. The building's ventilation doing its indifferent work. 26 minutes passed, which Tae-hyun measured against the clock on the wall with the focused attention of a man who has nothing to do but count. Lim came back. She sat. She folded her hands on the folder. The director has authorized a structured cooperation framework, she said. The terms will need to be formalized in documentation, which will take time. But the framework is authorized. She looked at him directly. You will provide full access to the Incheon facility. You will provide a complete cooperation statement covering the financial crimes documentation. You will provide testimony regarding the operational structure of the Black Dragon Syndicate, including named individuals. She paused. In return, the financial crimes charges will be scoped to documented conduct. The organized crime exposure will be addressed through the cooperation framework with sentencing recommendations reflective of your level of assistance. Timeline, Taehyun said. We move to Incheon tonight. She looked at Daewon. Counsel accompanies. Documentation is inventoried in the presence of both parties. Formal cooperation statement within 72 hours. Agreed, Daewon said. Lim looked at Taehyun. She was waiting for him to say it himself. Agreed, Taehyun said. The word left him, and the room received it, and something was done. He couldn't name what exactly. It wasn't relief, it wasn't grief, it wasn't the specific collapse of a thing ending. It was more like the feeling of a door closing on a room you have been standing in for a very long time. The click of the latch in the dark, the finality that is also, unexpectedly, the first moment of something other than the room. They drove to Incheon. 3 cars. Taehyun and Daewon in one, prosecutors and investigators in the second, a forensic documentation team in the third. The city moved past the windows in the early evening light. The Han River visible for a moment before the highway curved away from it, the lights beginning to come on in the buildings that lined the approach to the port. Taehyun sat in the back seat and watched the city he had spent 15 years building a kingdom inside, and he tried to remember what it had felt like to believe the kingdom was permanent. He couldn't quite reconstruct it. It had only been that morning, but it was already on the other side of something, already located in a before. The facility was a commercial storage building near the port, with a leased unit on the 3rd floor that appeared, on every document associated with it, to belong to a logistics company that did not conduct logistics. Taehyun had the physical key and the access code, and both were required simultaneously, which had always struck him as an elegant redundancy. He used both now, with Lim standing beside him and Daewon behind her and the documentation team waiting with their cases. The door opened. The room was exactly as he had last seen it. Filing units along 3 walls, a table in the center, 2 lamps on a timer that came on automatically when the door opened. Everything ordered, everything in its place. 15 years of the most precise records he had ever maintained, organized with the same methodical care he had brought to everything he built. The forensic team moved in. They began with the inventory. Taehyun stood in the doorway and watched them work, and he thought about a courtroom that morning and a woman in a gray cardigan who had told him she'd wanted to know if he could love her when she had nothing. He thought about what it meant that the answer to her question had not been complicated. He thought about what it meant that she had already known the answer before she asked. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize. He answered it because this was the night for answering things he had been avoiding. The voice on the line was clipped and careful, the voice of a man managing his own exposure while reaching into someone else's. One of the 2 senior syndicate members who had called Hwang about the Incheon access protocol. I heard you're cooperating, the voice said. Word travels, Taehyun said. You understand what that means for you, inside. I understand a great many things I didn't understand this morning. A pause. We had an arrangement, 15 years of... The arrangement is over. His voice was flat. Everything from today is different from everything before today. If you have a problem with the cooperation framework, retain counsel." He paused. "And don't call this number again." He ended the call. He looked at the phone for a moment. Then he turned it off entirely, pressed and held the button until the screen went dark. And he put it in his jacket pocket and stood in the doorway of a room full of everything he had built and watched strangers count it. Lim appeared beside him. She was looking at the filing units with the focused professional attention of a woman who has been building toward this room for 18 months and is now, for the first time, standing inside it. "This is complete," she said. It wasn't a question. "Complete," Taehyun said. "Everything, every account, every transaction, every correspondent, every name." Lim looked at him. For the first time since he'd entered her conference room, something in her expression shifted fractionally past the professional neutral. Not sympathy, not judgment. Something more like the recognition that passes between people who are both, in different ways, doing the hardest thing available to them. "The cooperation statement," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be there." She moved into the room to oversee the inventory. The documentation team worked quietly and methodically. Daewon was at the table reviewing something with one of the investigators. The lamps cast a warm and entirely incongruous light over all of it. Taehyun stepped back from the doorway. He leaned against the corridor wall, and the wall was cold through his jacket, and the port sounds came up from below. Machinery, distant horns, the constant low percussion of a place where things are loaded and unloaded in the dark. He breathed. His chest was tight, and his legs were tired with the specific bone-deep tiredness that arrived after a day that had operated at this velocity. And underneath the tiredness was something that had no clean name. The compound feeling of a man who has spent everything he had in a single day and is standing in the aftermath, tallying what remains. Not much remained. He knew that. The accounting was not complicated. But in the corridor of a port facility in Incheon, with the documentation team working inside and the prosecutor reviewing files and the city running its indifferent night operations below, Kang Tae-hyun understood something that the morning had been building toward without his knowledge. He had spent 15 years constructing a self that could not be reached, could not be questioned, could not be asked to account for what it had done or left undone, or looked past. He had built walls of money and reputation, and the particular armor of a man who had decided that power was the only language worth speaking. And a woman in a faded gray cardigan had walked through every single wall, not because she was stronger, but because she had been willing to be seen clearly, and he never had. The forensic team's lead investigator appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Kang, we'll need you to initial the inventory sheet as we go through each unit." Taehyun pushed off the wall. He straightened his jacket from habit. He walked back into the room, and he initialed the first page of the inventory, and then the second, and then the third. And the documentation team continued their work, and the night continued its work around them. And somewhere in the city that had once been his kingdom, the first morning of a different kind of life was already, without ceremony and without mercy, beginning to form. The cooperation statement took 4 hours and 19 minutes, and Tae-hyun remembered every word of it for the rest of his life. He arrived at the Seoul Central Prosecutor's office at 8:53 in the morning, 7 minutes early. In 15 years of running an empire, he had never arrived anywhere 7 minutes early unless he was the one who had set the time and intended the arrival as a statement of ownership. This morning, it was neither. It was simply that he had been awake since 4 and had nowhere else to be, and the hotel room that Daewon had paid for on a personal card had begun to feel like a pressure he couldn't breathe against, so he had dressed in yesterday's suit, pressed with the hotel iron, the best he could manage, and walked the 3 blocks to the building in the early morning cold with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the city assembling itself quietly around him, the street vendors setting up, the first buses running mostly empty, the particular gray-blue quality of Seoul before the sun fully commits. Lim Jae-young was already in the conference room when he arrived. So was Park, and 2 additional investigators he hadn't seen the previous day, and a court recorder who was arranging her equipment with the focused efficiency of someone who did not need to look at the people in the room to understand the nature of what was about to happen there. Daewon arrived 90 seconds after Tae-hyun, set his briefcase on the table, opened it, and placed a fresh notepad in front of him without speaking. The notepad was a small professional gesture that Tae-hyun registered and did not comment on, because what it communicated was simply, "I am here," and that was sufficient. Lim looked at Tae-hyun. She had the look of someone who had slept adequately and arrived prepared, which was the correct way to arrive at something you had spent 18 months building toward. "We'll begin with the financial structure," she said. "You'll speak. Park documents. I'll interrupt only for clarification. If you need water, there's a pitcher. If you need a break, say so." She paused. "Ready?" It was not a question. Tae-hyun folded his hands on the table and looked at the wall behind Lim's head for a moment. Not because there was anything on it, but because he needed 1 second of not meeting anyone's eyes. 1 second of locating himself in the room before he began dismantling everything he had spent 15 years constructing. Then he looked at Lim directly. He spoke for 92 minutes without notes. The financial structure came out of him the way structures come out of the people who built them, not recalled but inhabited, embedded in the tissue of daily decision-making until it was less something he knew than something he was. He named entities. He named accounts. He described the routing mechanisms with the precision of an architect describing a building from the foundation up. The Cayman Holding Company, the Singapore accounts, the Hong Kong shells, the nominee directors, the correspondent banks, the specific dates and amounts of the fund diversions. He described the layering strategy, how clean money moved. One direction, and operational funding moved another, and the two streams were kept parallel and never allowed to visibly touch, which was the essential craft of the whole construction and which had worked completely for 9 years before the woman across from him in the courthouse had begun, from inside his own household, quietly tracing the architecture. Park's pen moved continuously. The court recorder's equipment registered everything. Lim listened with the quality of attention that Tae-hyun had encountered only twice before in his life in people across a table from him. Total, without performance, the listening of someone for whom the information arriving is the only thing that exists in the room. When he reached the organized crime elements, he felt the room change the way rooms change when the thing being discussed is the thing that was always really being discussed but had to be approached through everything else first. The recorder's speed increased fractionally. One of the two additional investigators leaned forward a centimeter. Lim's stillness became a different quality of stillness. Not the practiced patience of the earlier section, but something more alert. The attention of a predator who has been tracking something through underbrush and has just heard it stop moving. Tae-hyun named 6 operational lieutenants. He gave names, positions, specific functions within the syndicate's structure. He described transaction histories. He described the communication protocols, the specific methods by which the organization had kept its operational discussions off digital infrastructure, which he had always considered the most important security practice and which had not in the end protected anything because the threat had not come from digital exposure. He named the financial conduits, 2 men who had operated in the space between the legitimate corporate arm and the operational accounts for 11 years, moving money in ways that were technically legal at each individual step and operationally criminal in aggregate. Describing this particular mechanism cost him something specific. These 2 men had been, in the limited way available to someone in his position, people he had trusted. Not trusted in the way ordinary people use that word. Trusted in the professional sense, which meant he had believed they would continue to do what they were paid to do as long as the structure held. That the structure had not held was not their failure. He named 3 law enforcement contacts. This section of the statement was the hardest, not because of sentiment, but because naming these men meant fully confronting the specific story he had told himself for 15 years about what he had built. He had told himself that his operation was cleaner than most, that the relationships he maintained with people in institutional positions were simply the pragmatic lubricant of a world that ran on mutual accommodation. Saying it aloud in a room with recorders stripped that story to its actual skeleton. He had paid people whose job was to enforce the law to not enforce it in his direction. The pragmatic framing didn't survive contact with the direct sentence. He said the direct sentence anyway. By the end of the 4 hours and 19 minutes, his voice had the quality of something that had been used to its full extent and was being sustained by something other than physical resources. His throat was dry despite the water. His hands, folded on the table throughout, were entirely still. The stillness not of composure, but of exhaustion that had moved past the point where agitation was available. Lim reviewed the summary Park had assembled in real time. She asked 3 clarifying questions, each of which Tae-hyun answered with the same directness he had maintained throughout. Then she set down the summary and looked at him. This is complete, she said. It was not quite a question. Complete, he said. A pause. I want to be direct with you about the sentencing framework implications, as I described them yesterday. The cooperation you've provided is substantial, and it will be reflected in the prosecutorial recommendation. But I want you to hear it again clearly so there's no ambiguity. She looked at him with the steady attention she had maintained throughout the morning. You will serve a custodial sentence. The cooperation reduces the term and shapes the conditions, but it does not eliminate custody. The documented conduct at scale requires an institutional response. I understand, Tae-hyun said. 7 to 12 years is the range comparable cases have produced with full cooperation. We will recommend the lower end of that range. Final determination is the court's. I understand, he said again. Lim looked at him for a moment longer. The assessment in her gaze was not unkind, but it was clear, the look of someone taking an honest measurement. You provided more than we expected, she said finally. I want you to know that's on the record. He nodded once. He didn't say thank you. It didn't feel like the right word for what had been exchanged in this room, which was not a favor but an accounting, and the only appropriate response to an accounting was accuracy. He and Daewon left the building at 1:22 in the afternoon. The sun was sharp and cold, and Tae-hyun stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it hit his face. Behind him, Seoul moved with its ordinary velocity. Pedestrians, traffic, the city in its Tuesday afternoon iteration, indifferent to the fact that a man on its sidewalk had just spent 4 hours and 19 minutes systematically dismantling everything he had spent 15 years building. Cities were good at that indifference. He had always relied on it, and he appreciated it now from a different angle. The criminal defense specialist, Daewon said, coming to stand beside him. Choi Soo-yeon. I've already sent her the preliminary case summary. She'll want to meet this week. Arrange it. And the civil proceedings, the divorce continuation. The asset picture is substantially simplified by the restraint orders. There's less to contest than there was Monday morning. Daewon paused. That can be framed as administrative at this point. Handle it, Tae-hyun said. He looked at the sidewalk. I need to call my brother. He called Tae-min from a bench near the building's entrance because he didn't have a destination and didn't have a car, and the bench was available. Tae-min answered before the second ring, which meant he had been waiting, which meant he had been sitting with his phone visible all morning, which was a thing Tae-hyun registered and did not comment on, because commenting on it would require a vocabulary he hadn't developed. It's done, Tae-hyun said. A silence. Then, how are you? I've been better. That's not what I asked. Tae-hyun looked at the street. A taxi moved past. A woman was walking a small dog on an extendable leash, and the dog kept pulling toward the base of a nearby tree, and the woman was checking her phone and letting it pull, which was a small, complete picture of someone being insufficiently present to the thing that needed them. He watched this for a moment. I don't know how I am, he said. I know what I did this morning, and I know what the next year looks like in broad terms and past, that I don't have a clear picture. Come to the apartment tonight, Tae-min said. Have dinner. The children would... They miss you. Tae-hyun closed his eyes for a moment. Tae-min had 2 children, 11 and 8, who had been to their uncle's various corporate events and holiday gatherings with the detached politeness of children who sense that an adult is important in ways they cannot yet assess. He had never sat on the floor with them. He had never been to one of their school events. He had sent appropriate gifts at appropriate times and been present at the gatherings that mattered for family appearances, and in 11 years of being their uncle, he had not once asked either of them what they were interested in. All right, he said, tonight. He walked to the Han River because it was 40 minutes away on foot, and he needed 40 minutes of not receiving information, not making decisions, not being in a room where his presence had implications. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his face into the cold, and the city moved around him, continuous and indifferent, which was exactly what he needed it to be. The river was gray-green and wide and running. He stood at the embankment railing and watched the water and didn't think, or tried not to think, which was its own kind of thinking. After 20 minutes, he sat on a bench and watched the water instead of standing, and the difference in posture made something settle in his chest slightly, some held thing releasing by a fraction. His phone had 67 notifications. He looked at the number on the screen and turned the phone face down on the bench beside him and left it there. He thought about attorney Baek Sung-jin, who was 81 years old and had been practicing law for 56 years, and had walked into a courthouse with a folded jacket and a closed folder and had proceeded to dismantle everything with the calm efficiency of a man who had been preparing for a very long time and had not needed to rush a single moment of it. He thought about what it would take to be 81 years old and still have that quality of focused patience. And he thought that it probably required having spent your life working on things you believed were worth working on, which was a thought he couldn't complete in any comfortable direction. He thought about the prenuptial agreement. He had insisted on it before the wedding, with the ruthless practical clarity of a man protecting assets he had worked to acquire. He had handed it to her attorney with the confidence of someone setting a trap. Every clause in it had been designed to protect his interests in the event of dissolution, and it had protected his interests. It had protected her interests completely, because protecting separate premarital assets cut in both directions, and he had been too certain of the imbalance between them to consider the direction she might be protected from. He had built the cage for himself. The thought arrived without irony and without the cushion of distance. He had built the cage for himself and had handed her the key and had spent 11 years inside it believing he was free. He picked up the phone. He turned it over and looked at the notifications, and then he looked at the river, and then he called Taemin again, which was not what he'd planned, but which was what his hands did when he stopped managing them. "I need to tell you something," he said when his brother answered. "Before tonight, I need to say it now." "All right," Taemin said without hesitation. "I'm sorry for what this has cost you. The corporate exposure, the name association, the years of working inside something that was what it was." He stopped. The river moved. "You deserved better than what I built. You deserved to build something that could stand on its own." A long silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of someone receiving something they were not expecting and are taking the time to receive it correctly. "I know what you're doing," Taemin said finally. "What am I doing?" "You're trying to close accounts, because that's how you think, in terms of what's owed and what's settled and what can be resolved." A pause. "Some things don't close, Taehyun. Some things you just carry differently as time goes on." Another pause. "I'm not owed an apology. I made my own choices about where I worked and why. I need you to let me own that." Taehyun was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Tonight," Taemin said. 7 o'clock. The children eat early, but they'll stay up." He went to Taemin's apartment at 7 and ate dinner at a table where an 11-year-old girl talked about a science project involving the water cycle with the intense focus of someone who had recently discovered a deep interest and was not yet self-conscious about its depth. The 8-year-old boy sat beside Taehyun and ate his rice with the methodical concentration of a child who takes food seriously, and at one point looked up at his uncle and said, with complete directness, "Are you sad?" The table went quiet. Taemin's wife, Soo-jin, glanced across the table with the careful attention of a woman who has learned when to intervene and when to let a moment resolve itself. Taehyun looked at his nephew. The boy's face was open and without guile, the face of someone who had asked the question because he wanted to know the answer and had not yet learned that adults sometimes find direct questions uncomfortable. "Yes," Taehyun said, "I am." The boy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Is it the bad kind, or the kind that gets better?" "I think the kind that gets better," Taehyun said. "But slowly." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his rice. The 11-year-old resumed the water cycle explanation. Soo-jin poured more barley tea. Taemin caught his brother's eye across the table and looked away again. And in the looking away there was everything that needed to be said, and had been said, and didn't need saying again. The tribunal convened 7 months and 3 weeks after the courthouse. The criminal defense specialist, attorney Choi Soo-yeon, had spent those months doing what Daewon had described as work that should not have been possible to do, and had done it anyway. She was 53 and had the specific quality of someone who had stopped being impressed by powerful defendants at roughly the same time she had stopped being afraid of powerful prosecutors, which was early in her career and had made her, depending on who you asked, either invaluable or dangerous. She had negotiated the international jurisdiction coordination, Singapore and Hong Kong, aligned under a consolidated framework with Seoul as primary jurisdiction. With a patience and precision that had apparently exhausted 2 foreign counsel teams, and produced an outcome that her counterparts described in the legal press as anomalous. Tae-hyun appeared at the tribunal in a suit that was not the charcoal one. Tae-min had brought it to the hotel, pressed, in a garment bag, the morning of the first day, and had stood in the hotel room doorway while Tae-hyun put it on, and had said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and Tae-min had always understood this with unusual clarity. The tribunal took 3 days. Heron testified on the second day. She wore gray. She sat in the witness chair with the composed posture of someone who had spent 7 months preparing for exactly this and had used the time well. She answered every question in full, without hedging, without the qualifications of someone protecting their own position, because her own position was already protected by the immunity framework her attorney had negotiated. She described transactions. She described conversations. She described the specific texture of receiving expensive things from a man and choosing not to ask where they came from, which was a choice rather than an ignorance, and she said so, which was the thing in her testimony that Tae-hyun found most unexpected, and which cost her more credibility in the room than anything else, and which he found, in some complicated way, more honest than anything else she had ever said to him. She did not look at him once during the 2 hours she sat in the chair. 6 of the 7 people named in Tae-hyun's cooperation statement faced charges. 3 pleaded guilty within weeks of the indictments. 2 contested. 1. The Busan-adjacent lieutenant who had been making calls about Incheon the morning of the courthouse, attempted to move to Macau 12 days after being notified of his indictment and was returned under international agreement. The law enforcement contacts, when their names surfaced through the prosecutorial process, produced the specific kind of institutional horror that resulted in a Metropolitan Police internal review that was still ongoing at the time of Tae-hyun's sentencing. Oh Jae-sung moved into the Han River Corridor territory within 6 weeks of the courthouse. He did it quietly and quickly and with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this specific opening for 6 years. Tae-hyun received this information through a contact filtered through Daewon's office and received it with a feeling he could not name, not grief, not anger, not the territorial reflex he would have expected. Something more like the feeling of watching weather change from inside a room you are no longer going outside in. The territory had been his. It was no longer his. Both of these things were simply true, and the second one followed from the choices that had made the first one possible, and the logic of that was complete. The divorce was finalized in the 4th month, a continuation hearing lasting 38 minutes. Tae-hyun was not present. Attorney Choi appeared on his behalf for the civil matter, coordinating with Daewon. The prenuptial agreement stood intact. Imani's premarital assets remained entirely hers. The marital household and its accumulated 11 years of objects and furniture and art were liquidated through the receivership process managing the restrained assets, with proceeds directed toward the creditor estate claims. There was nothing to argue about because there was nothing left that the prenuptial agreement hadn't already addressed, which was its original purpose and which now served a completely different direction than the one he had intended. Daewon called him with the outcome on a Tuesday afternoon. "It's done," he said. "All right," Tae-hyun said. A pause on the line. "How are you holding up?" It was not a question Daewon had asked before in 15 years of professional relationship, and the asking of it now was its own kind of statement about what the last 8 months had changed between them. "I'm standing," Tae-hyun said. "That's the accurate answer." "It's a sufficient one," Daewon said. The tribunal's 3rd day produced the sentencing panel's deliberation, 6 hours and 14 minutes, which Attorney Choi described as longer than she'd expected and shorter than she'd feared. When the presiding judge returned and settled the room and began to read, Tae-hyun sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and listened with the specific focused attention of someone who has learned, through a very difficult process, to be present in rooms rather than already planning the exit. The financial crimes base term, 11 years. Reduced, on the documented basis of the cooperation framework and the comprehensive and voluntary nature of the assistance provided, to 7 years. The organized crime elements addressed through concurrent structuring. Total custodial period, 7 years. Eligibility for early release consideration at the halfway mark, subject to conduct assessment and rehabilitation program evaluation. 7 years. He heard the number and let it settle into him the way cold settles. Not all at once, but in layers, the full weight arriving only after the initial impact had passed. 7 years was not an abstraction. 7 years was time, specific, counted time, during which the world would continue its operations and he would observe them from inside a structure he had not chosen. Attorney Choi had told him in the week before sentencing that 7 years was the outcome she had worked toward and that achieving it was not guaranteed and that it represented the maximum reasonable result of everything they had done in the preceding months. She said this without sentiment because she was not a sentimental attorney, which was the correct kind of attorney for him to have had. The presiding judge also read, into the record, a notation. It was procedurally non-binding. It carried no legal weight, but it was said aloud, in a court with a recorder and a panel and all of the institutional apparatus of formal justice. And it said, the cooperation provided in this matter was substantive, voluntary, and of material benefit to the resolution of a significant organized crime case. The court notes this contribution in the context of the defendant's demonstrated capacity for accountability. Tae-hyun heard this too. He heard it the way you hear something you didn't know you needed to hear until you heard it. Not because it changed anything material, but because it was true. And truth said aloud in a room built for truth had a weight that he had not previously understood, having spent his life in rooms built for other things. He was taken into custody at the close of proceedings. The facility was a correctional institution in Gyeonggi Province, 60 kilometers from Seoul, not the high-security designation. Standard housing, general population, structured daily program. He arrived in the late afternoon, processed through intake with the institutional efficiency that intake processes operate at, documents, photographs, personal item inventory, facility orientation, and was shown to the housing unit as the facility's evening routine was concluding. He lay in the bunk that night and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the facility at night, which were the sounds of many people existing in proximity, breathing, occasional movement, the facility's ventilation system doing its continuous work. And he did not sleep for a long time, not from distress, but from the particular alertness of a person arriving somewhere new and needing to map it before they can rest. He learned the rehabilitation program's funding source on the second day. A facility staff member mentioned it offhandedly during the orientation walkthrough of the program components. Vocational training, community service, structured counseling curriculum. The Okoye Royal Foundation, she said. Partnership initiative. Runs across several correctional institutions in South Korea. Good program, she added, with the practical appreciation of someone who had seen the program work. Tae-hyun received this information while standing in a corridor with a clipboard of orientation documents, and he stood with it for a moment, not visibly, not in a way the staff member would have registered, and then he completed the orientation and returned to his housing unit and sat on the edge of the bunk and thought about a woman who had been offered, by the full weight of what had happened in a courthouse, the satisfaction of maximum institutional punishment, and had instead asked for justice. And then had apparently decided, on her own terms, that justice included this. He started the program in his third week. The work was simple and physical and structured. Laundry rotation, facility maintenance, community kitchen. It required his actual hands in a way that 15 years of building a financial empire had not, which was not a complaint but an observation. The specific texture of work that involved his body, rather than his calculations, was unfamiliar and required adjustment. And then, after adjustment, became the thing he looked forward to each morning, which he had not expected and which he found he had no framework for dismissing. He called Tae-min once a week on the facility phone. The calls were 30 minutes, and Tae-min used them efficiently, which was his nature. The reconstruction of the legitimate businesses, 3 of the 7 had been salvageable, separated cleanly from the criminal elements by Tae-min's 3 years of running the operational side with enough personal integrity to document the separation credibly. He renamed them. He retained who he could retain. He rebuilt with the methodical patience of someone who had always understood that the legitimate work was the only work that lasted and had been waiting, with the particular patience of a younger brother, for the space to build it without the shadow of the other thing falling across it. On the 43rd day, a letter arrived through standard facility mail, screened, logged, delivered with the week's correspondence. The envelope had no return address. He recognized the handwriting before he opened it. He read it twice at the small desk in his housing unit. Then he folded it along its original creases and placed it in the approved personal item container, the small box of things he was permitted to keep. And he did not take it out again for weeks, but he did not put it at the bottom of the box either. He kept it accessible. The letter was 4 sentences long. She had written it in the handwriting he recognized from 11 years of grocery lists and household notes, and the occasional card left on his desk in the early years of the marriage before the distance settled in. The first sentence said she hoped he was well, which was a simple thing, and she said it without apparent irony. The second sentence explained that the Foundation's involvement in the facility program was part of a broader initiative, and she wanted him to know this in case its presence felt otherwise. The third sentence said she had thought a great deal about what it costs a person to tell the truth when they've built their life on not telling it, and that she respected what that cost. The fourth sentence said, "I did love you. I want you to know that it was real, even if nothing around it was." He sat with these 4 sentences for a long time. He didn't write back immediately. He waited 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks he worked the program and made his calls and ate in the common room and walked the yard and read in the facility library. And he let the letter settle into him until he understood what he wanted to say and was certain it was what he actually meant, rather than what the situation seemed to call for. Then he wrote back. He addressed it to the Royal Bank of Canberra, marked for the principal's attention, understanding that it might be received by staff and might not reach her, and that both outcomes were appropriate. He wrote without calculation, without the specific management of impression that had characterized almost every word he had ever put in writing. He told her the program was good work and that he was doing it. He told her he had been reading about the company restructuring, a business journal in the facility library, 3rd month in, and that he had thought about what she had built with what he had left behind, and that it was better than anything he had built with it. He told her that he understood now what she had meant in the courthouse hallway, when she said she wanted to know if he could love her when she had nothing. He told her he hadn't understood the question when she was asking it, and that he was sorry for that, not for the legal outcome, which he understood was correct, but for the 11 years of not understanding the question. He sealed the envelope. He sent it through the facility's mail process. He received no response, which he had not expected to receive, and the absence of response was its own complete thing that required no filling. In the second year, Attorney Choi sent a brief update through the formal correspondence channel. The international coordination had concluded. Singapore and Hong Kong had formally closed their parallel proceedings in deference to the Seoul sentencing, consistent with the consolidated framework. The financial crimes matter was fully resolved across all jurisdictions. What remained was time, the specific counted time that 7 years represented. He read this update in the facility library on a Thursday morning and set it down on the reading table and looked at the narrow window for a while. The view through the window was a portion of the exercise yard, and above that, a rectangle of sky, the particular gray-blue of an early spring sky that hadn't fully committed to warmth yet. He looked at this sky for long enough that it changed slightly, a cloud moving through, the light shifting by a fraction. And then he put the letter back in the envelope and returned it to the correspondence folder and went back to his assigned morning task, which was laundry, and which he did with the same careful attention he had been bringing to it since the 3rd week. The laundry was not a metaphor. It was laundry. Heavy institutional fabric, industrial machines, the specific sensory vocabulary of clean heat and clean smell, and the rhythmic physical certainty of folding. He had mocked it once. He had mocked her for it. He had described the maintenance of a household in a courthouse as the contribution of a woman who had contributed nothing, and the specific falseness of that description had been evident in the room to everyone except himself, which was perhaps the most complete description of who he had been. He folded the laundry with his actual hands, and the work was real, and that was sufficient. In the 3rd year, a journalist published a long feature about Princess Imani Adebayo Okoye in an international business magazine. The facility library received the magazine 2 weeks after its publication date. Tae-hyun found it on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at a reading table with the winter light coming through the narrow windows and read it from the beginning. The article covered the transformation of the seized corporate holdings. 3,400 jobs created across 8 companies now operating in South Korea and 4 African nations. Supplier relationships established with 112 local businesses in regions previously excluded from international investment consideration. A microfinance initiative developed in partnership with 3 South Korean universities. The Okoye Foundation's correctional rehabilitation programs, operating across 7 facilities. An international humanitarian recognition that she had received the previous year, which she had accepted briefly and returned to work the following day. The article described her in personal terms briefly and with the care of someone who understood that the personal dimension was not the point, but that it was present. That she had returned to the kingdom of Coimbra and resumed a formal role in the royal household while continuing to lead the bank. That she carried herself in public spaces with a quality that people who encountered her consistently described the same way, which was simply that she was fully present to whatever she was in, which sounded unremarkable and was, in practice, apparently rare enough that people mentioned it. Near the end of the article there was a photograph. A conference room somewhere, high ceilings, other figures soft at the frame's edges. She was in deep blue, her hair natural, her reading glasses pushed up on her nose, looking at something off camera with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what was being said. Beside her, partially out of frame, was a man, African. His shoulder visible against hers, his gaze directed at her rather than at what she was watching. Taehyun looked at this photograph for a long time. He looked at the man who was looking at Imani the way you look at something when you are not assessing its utility, but are simply glad of its presence. He looked at Imani, who was not aware of being looked at, and was simply being herself in a room, and he thought about 11 years of being in rooms with her and how many times she had been simply herself, and he had not registered it because he had not been looking. He thought about the graduate student apartment with 3 roommates, the second-hand laptop, the student visa. He thought about how she had carried her actual self through all of it without once requiring the world to acknowledge it, which was the thing he had never understood about her, and now understood completely. She did not need to be recognized to know who she was. She had always known who she was. She had simply wanted to find out if someone else could see it without being shown. He closed the magazine. He set it back in its place on the shelf, spine aligned with the others. He sat at the reading table for another few minutes with his hands on the surface and the winter light doing its slow work through the narrow windows. And he thought about what it meant to spend your whole life building a self that could not be questioned and to discover, through the most complete possible destruction of that self, that the thing you were protecting was not worth the wall. He thought about an ordinary Tuesday morning years ago. Not a significant morning, not a morning that had any weight at the time, when Imani had sat across a breakfast table from him in a faded cardigan and asked how he slept. He had been looking at his phone. He had answered without looking up. She had looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then looked back at her coffee, and the moment had passed unregistered, the way the most important moments almost always do when you are too occupied with the performance of your own importance to notice what is actually in the room with you. He stood from the reading table. He put on his jacket. He walked back through the facility corridor toward the housing unit, and through the narrow window at the corridor's end, the exercise yard was visible in the fading afternoon light. Just ground, just sky, just the ordinary geometry of a bounded space. And he paused at the window for a moment and looked at it, not because it was beautiful, which it was not, but because it was real, and it was the available view. And he had learned, over the course of 3 years and a great deal of folded laundry and the careful counted rhythm of days that were simple and required his actual presence, that the available view was worth looking at. Then he kept walking, because the evening routine was beginning and there was work to be done before lights out, and he had stopped, somewhere in the accumulated months, thinking of the work as beneath him, which turned out to be the same thing as stopping thinking of himself as above it, which turned out to be the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet, but was willing to keep showing up for until he did. Kang Tae-hyun had walked into a courthouse on a Tuesday morning in a charcoal suit believing he was ending a story. He had been wrong about which story was ending. He had been wrong, it turned out, about a great many things, about the woman across the table, about the value of what he had built, about what power actually protected you from, about the specific and catastrophic cost of looking at what's in the room with you and seeing only what confirms the story you're already telling about yourself. But he was no longer wrong about the laundry. He folded it carefully, and he folded it right, and it was clean, and it was real, and it would be there tomorrow, the same work, requiring the same hands, and that was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough.